Grace, the college fund has been reassigned. Your brother needs it more. He's the future of this family. My father's words cut through our Sunday dinner like a blade designed to sever 18 years of promises. $23,000, every penny I'd saved from high school jobs, every birthday check from grandparents, every sacrifice I'd made walking to school instead of taking the bus to save application fees, vanished into Tyler's future while mine evaporated in a single sentence. The aunts and uncles chuckled with knowing satisfaction. A girl doesn't need a degree, my cousin Jake smirked, his voice dripping with casual dismissal. Why waste tuition on someone who'll end up cooking for her husband? Their laughter carved into me like shrapnel, each chuckle a reminder that in this family, women were investments with poor returns, temporary residents whose ambitions mattered less than the sons who carried the Miller name forward. But as I sat there, fingers trembling around my water glass, I felt something igniting in my chest that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with determination that burns too hot to be extinguished by other people's limitations. They thought they'd ended my story by stealing my fund. They had no idea they'd just started my fire. My name is Grace Miller. I'm 33 years old now, but I was 17 when my family decided my dreams didn't matter enough to fund them. The night they stole my college fund, I lay awake on sheets that smelled like the fabric softener my mother bought in bulk from Costco, staring at a ceiling that had heard every prayer, every plan, every whispered promise I'd made to myself about the woman I was going to become. The darkness pressed against my chest like a physical weight, heavier than the betrayal, heavier than the realization that the people who were supposed to protect my future had just sold it to pay for my brother's. Under my bed, college brochures lay stacked like evidence of a crime that would never be prosecuted. Northwestern University of Chicago, DePaul, glossy promises of lecture halls and libraries, study abroad programs and internships that would transform me from Grace Miller, the girl whose family thought education was wasted on daughters, into someone whose voice mattered in rooms where decisions got made. I'd filled out dozens of applications, my handwriting cramped from hours spent at our kitchen table while Tyler watched Netflix in the living room, his future secured by lottery of birth and genitalia. Each form had required a $25 application fee that I'd earned working double shifts at McDonald's, standing over fry baskets that left my hair smelling like grease and my dreams smelling like desperation. The notebooks were worse than the brochures. 5 spiral-bound journals filled with scribbled plans for a future they'd laughed away in one Sunday dinner conversation, business administration with a minor in psychology, pre-law track with internships at downtown Chicago firms, graduate school possibilities that would transform the girl from Naperville into someone who commanded respect rather than dismissal. Every page represented hours of research, late-night planning sessions where I'd calculated tuition costs against expected earnings, financial aid possibilities against family contributions that I'd assumed would materialize because parents were supposed to want their children to succeed regardless of gender. The memory that kept replaying like a broken record was Tyler raising his wine glass, the first time Dad had ever let him drink alcohol at a family gathering, and delivering what he'd thought was a gracious acceptance speech. "Thanks, sis, for the car and the tuition," he'd said, his 18-year-old voice cracking slightly with excitement and entitlement. "I promise I'll make the family proud at state." Everyone had cheered. Aunt Margaret had dabbed her eyes with a napkin. Uncle Jim had clapped Tyler on the back with the kind of masculine approval that comes when bloodlines are preserved and family names get carried forward by sons who matter. I'd memorized every sound of their laughter, cataloged each smile that celebrated my brother's gain built on my loss. The way Aunt Lisa had nodded approvingly, like she was witnessing natural order being restored. The way my cousin Jake had smirked, probably calculating how much money his own parents would save by having daughters whose educations were considered optional investments. But it was my mother's reaction that cut deepest. Later, when the dishes were cleared, and the extended family had driven home to their own houses where daughters' dreams weren't used as currency for sons' ambitions, she'd found me crying in my bedroom, surrounded by college brochures that now felt like evidence of how naive I'd been about my place in the Miller family hierarchy. "It's better this way, sweetheart," she'd whispered, her voice carrying the kind of defeated wisdom that comes from women who'd learned to accept limitations as natural law, rather than imposed restrictions. "Education doesn't feed you. Marriage does. A good husband will take better care of you than any degree ever could." Her fingers had been cold when she'd brushed my hair back, The same hands that had signed permission slips for advanced placement classes, that had driven me to SAT prep courses, that had helped me research scholarship opportunities during hours when she should have been sleeping. "But you went to college, Mom," I'd said through tears that tasted like salt and broken promises. "And look where it got me," she'd replied, gesturing toward a house that represented everything she'd given up to become Mrs. Robert Miller, supporter of his dreams, facilitator of his success, invisible partner in achievements that would never bear her name. My father had been different in his cruelty, not malicious, just absent. He'd avoided eye contact during dinner, focusing on his wine glass like it contained answers to questions he'd never bothered to ask about whether his daughter's intelligence might be worth the same investment he'd automatically assumed his son deserved. When I'd tried to approach him later, standing in his den where financial documents and tax papers covered every surface, he'd looked up from bills with the expression of someone who'd already moved on to other concerns. "Grace, honey, this isn't personal," he'd said, his voice carrying the tone he probably used with employees who'd been laid off for budget reasons. "Tyler's got a full ride for football. Your money will get him through the expenses that aren't covered. It's just practical." Practical. $23,000 of my sacrifice reduced to a practical decision that would launch my brother into a future where my contributions would be forgotten as soon as his first semester began. That night, lying in darkness that felt heavier than it had any right to feel, I made calculations that had nothing to do with college applications and everything to do with survival strategies that didn't require family approval. Community college would cost $3,000 a year if I stayed at home. I could work full-time and take evening classes, building toward a degree that no one could steal because no one would know it existed until it was already earned. The plan that formed in that darkness wasn't about revenge. It was about refusing to accept that my worth was determined by other people's limitations, that my future was contingent on recognition from people who'd proven they couldn't see past gender to recognize potential. They'd taught me that dreams without funding were just fantasies. I was about to learn whether fantasies could become realities when they were powered by something stronger than family support. Something like fury that burns cold and builds quietly until it becomes unstoppable. The fluorescent lights in the Riverside Community Center flickered like dying stars at 2 a.m, casting shadows that danced across linoleum floors. I'd been scrubbing for 3 hours with industrial cleaner that left my teenage hands raw and chemical burned. This was my new reality. 18 years old, working overnight custodial shifts that paid $8.50 an hour in cash while my classmates slept in beds their parents had bought, dreaming of futures their families would fund without question. Every dollar I earned smelled like pine sol and tasted like determination mixed with something that might have been desperation if I'd allowed myself to call it that. Community college wasn't the gleaming university campus I'd imagined, but the classrooms at Harper College still held the promise of transformation. $3,000 per semester meant I needed to work 40 hours a week just to break even, not counting textbooks, gas money, or food that wasn't ramen noodles and peanut butter sandwiches. The math was brutal and precise. Each paycheck disappeared into tuition installments, secondhand textbooks with someone else's highlighter marks still bleeding yellow across pages I'd read until my eyes burned, coffee from the student union that tasted like it had been brewed with tap water and crushed dreams. I lived off exhaustion and stubbornness in equal measure, catching 20-minute naps between classes and shifts, learning to function on 4 hours of sleep, and the kind of anger that crystallizes into focus when you've got no choice between success and surrender. My professors noticed. Dr. Rodriguez, who taught Introduction to Business Administration at 8 a.m., would catch me nodding off over my notebook and ask with the concern that good teachers carry for students who are trying too hard. "Grace, how do you stay awake in class after working nights? Are you getting enough rest?" I'd smile with practiced brightness, the kind that hides exhaustion behind white teeth and eye contact that never wavered. "I'm fine, Professor, just adjusting to the schedule." But I never told them I was surviving a robbery that had been committed by my own family, that every hour I spent in their classrooms was bought with sleep I couldn't afford and paid for with money. I'd earned $1 at a time, while Tyler coasted through Northwestern on funds that had originally been saved one birthday check at a time by the sister who now scrubbed floors to afford the education he'd inherited. The contrast was inescapable. While I calculated whether I could afford both gas and groceries in the same week, Tyler's Instagram showed him at fraternity parties, spring break trips to Cancun, a new Honda Civic that Dad had bought to supplement the college fund that was supposed to last 4 years. Every post felt like salt rubbed into wounds that never quite healed. Tyler at football games, Tyler at bars. Tyler with girlfriends who probably assumed his confidence came from natural charisma rather than the financial security that comes from having dreams funded by someone else's sacrifice. But it was the late nights that forged me into something different from the girl who'd cried over stolen dreams. After my custodial shift ended at 6 a.m., I'd drive home through sunrise that painted Naperville streets gold and pink, park in the driveway next to Tyler's car, and slip into the house where everyone still slept. In my bedroom, I'd sit at the desk I'd bought from Goodwill for $12 and write in the journal that had become my confession booth, my war room, my promise keeper. Day 127 since the theft. I'd written that October morning, my handwriting shaky from caffeine and determination. Tyler posted photos from his economic study group at some restaurant that costs more than I make in a week. They stole my fund. One day, I'll make them remember that theft. The words felt like prophecy even as I wrote them, like promises that would eventually demand to be kept by the woman I was becoming, through exhaustion and fury and refusal to accept that my worth was determined by other people's assumptions about what daughters deserved. My brother coasted through college on momentum that had been purchased with my money, building memories that would last forever while I built character that would last longer. He went to parties funded by my McDonald's paychecks while I went to libraries where I studied until they closed, then sat in my car with a flashlight finishing homework that had to be perfect because I couldn't afford to fail anything. But every sleepless night was also construction time, building something that felt like a fortress made of ambition and anger in equal parts. Each A+ on an exam was another brick in walls that would eventually protect dreams too strong to be stolen. Each successful semester was proof that I could survive on determination alone when family support wasn't available for daughters. The work-study program in the business office gave me insight into how universities operated, not just as educational institutions, but as businesses that understood exactly how much students would sacrifice for degrees that could transform their lives. I watched other working students struggle through the same calculations I'd mastered, the same midnight math that balanced sleep against success. But I also watched students like Tyler, who attended classes like they were shopping for experiences rather than investing everything they had in futures that weren't guaranteed. Students whose biggest worry was whether to study abroad in Italy or Spain, while I was calculating whether I could afford both textbooks and groceries in the same month. The difference wasn't intelligence or potential. It was simply that some people inherited the luxury of treating education as exploration, while others earned it through exhaustion that left permanent shadows under their eyes and calluses on their hands. By my second semester, something had shifted. The raw anger that had sustained me through those first months of cleaning floors and counting dollars was crystallizing into something sharper, more surgical. I wasn't just surviving the theft of my college fund anymore. I was using it as fuel for something bigger than Tyler's coasted success could ever become. The girl they'd robbed was disappearing, replaced by someone who understood that the most dangerous enemies are the ones who don't look dangerous at all. Someone who could smile through exhaustion, work through pain, and build dreams one sleepless night at a time, while everyone who dismissed her slept comfortably on assumptions that were about to become very expensive mistakes. I was learning that revenge doesn't always announce itself with dramatic confrontations. Sometimes it just shows up quietly, wearing a cap and gown, holding a degree that was paid for with something more valuable than money. Sometimes revenge looks like success that couldn't be stolen because it was built by hands too strong to let go of dreams that mattered more than sleep. 16 years had passed since the night they stole my college fund, and the Chicago Hilton Ballroom looked exactly like the kind of place where successful people gathered to congratulate themselves on achievements that looked inevitable in hindsight, but had been anything but guaranteed when the work was happening in shadows. The Northwestern University Alumni Gala sparkled with crystal chandeliers that cast dancing lights across marble floors, where 500 graduates mingled in designer suits and evening gowns, their conversations buzzing with the comfortable arrogance of people who'd turned expensive educations into profitable careers. But this time, I wasn't the girl pressed against glass windows looking in at privilege I couldn't afford. This time, my name was etched in gold lettering on the program as the keynote speaker, Grace Miller, founder and CEO, Miller Strategic Consulting, Northwestern's Distinguished Alumni Award recipient. The journey from community college custodial worker to management consultant hadn't been linear or elegant. It had been 16 years of night classes and weekend seminars, professional certifications earned between double shifts, networking events attended in suits I'd bought at outlet stores, and practiced conversations in mirrors until confidence became indistinguishable from competence. My company now employed 47 people and had contracts with 6 Fortune 500 corporations who paid premium rates for strategic advice that came from someone who'd learned business operations, from the ground up rather than the boardroom down. The dress I wore to this gala cost more than I'd earned in my first month at the community center, but I'd bought it with money I'd earned by transforming the work ethic that family betrayal had forced me to develop. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was being honored by the university my brother had attended with money that had originally been saved for my education. But irony felt less important than vindication when I walked through that ballroom wearing success that no one could steal because it had been built by hands too calloused to let go of dreams. That's when I saw Tyler. He stood by the bar with the defeated posture of someone who'd learned that potential without persistence becomes nothing more than cocktail party conversation. His suit was expensive but frayed at the edges, probably bought during better years when his Northwestern degree still felt like currency rather than receipt for opportunities he'd wasted. The whispers followed him like a Greek chorus of consequences. Tyler Miller. Remember him? Football scholarship, business degree, seemed like he had everything handed to him. Heard he's been unemployed for 8 months now. Third company to let him go. Something about attitude problems and entitlement issues. Wasted everything his family sacrificed for him. Someone added with the casual cruelty that comes from people who've never had to sacrifice anything for success. His sister's the one who made something of herself. Funny how that works out sometimes. The recognition hit Tyler's face like a physical blow when he spotted me across that crowded ballroom. The confident smirk that had carried him through years of taking what he hadn't earned disappeared, replaced by something that looked dangerously close to panic. For 16 years, I'd imagined this moment would feel like victory. I'd pictured confrontation, dramatic speeches about justice delayed but not denied, the kind of satisfying vindication that comes from watching someone realize they'd underestimated the wrong person. But standing there in a ballroom full of people who were celebrating achievements I'd built from nothing while Tyler struggled with consequences of opportunities he'd squandered, I felt something more complicated than revenge. I felt pity. The brother who'd inherited my college fund had also inherited the assumption that success would continue to arrive without effort, that potential was the same as achievement, that family money was a guarantee rather than an investment that required returns. He'd coasted through Northwestern on momentum purchased with my McDonald's paychecks, graduated into a world where his degree opened doors but his work ethic, or lack thereof, determined whether those doors stayed open. Without the discipline that comes from earning everything twice, without the hunger that drives people who've survived theft to protect what they've built, Tyler had been equipped for a world that no longer existed. The economy had shifted. The job market had evolved. The connections that had seemed permanent during college had proven temporary when performance didn't match promise. Companies wanted results, not pedigree, and Tyler had spent 4 years learning to expect privilege rather than deliver excellence. As he approached me through the crowd with the desperate energy of someone who'd finally realized the magnitude of his miscalculation, I saw something in his eyes that completed the transformation that had begun 16 years earlier in our family's dining room. Fear. Not the comfortable concern of someone worried about temporary setbacks, but the existential terror of someone who'd just realized they'd built their entire identity on foundations that were crumbling. "Grace," he said, his voice carrying none of the casual dismissal that had characterized our childhood interactions. I didn't know you'd be here. Congratulations on all this." His gesture encompassed not just the award ceremony but everything it represented. The company I'd built, the success I'd earned, the respect I'd commanded from people who measured worth by results rather than inheritance. "Thank you, Tyler," I said, my voice carrying the kind of professional courtesy I'd learned to deploy in boardrooms where emotion was liability rather than asset. "How are you doing?" The question hung in the air between us like smoke from expensive cigars, but this time the smoke was clearing to reveal truths that had been building for 16 years. The sister he'd dismissed as someone whose dreams didn't matter had just been honored for achievements built from the ashes of those dreams. The brother who'd claimed her college fund had just discovered that some investments fail to generate expected returns. And in that ballroom full of successful people who'd earned their places through various combinations of privilege and persistence, we both understood that the real education had happened outside those university walls, in the space between having dreams stolen and deciding whether theft would become excuse or motivation. Tuller had chosen excuse. I'd chosen motivation. The difference was standing in a ballroom where one of us was being celebrated, and the other was learning that some mistakes take 16 years to fully understand. The MC's voice cut through the ballroom chatter like a ceremonial sword announcing the arrival of royalty. Dr. Margaret Chen, Northwestern's Alumni Relations Director, stood at the podium with the kind of professional poise that comes from delivering news that changes rooms full of people. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my distinct honor to introduce tonight's keynote speaker and the recipient of our Distinguished Alumni Award. Please welcome someone who represents the very best of Northwestern's values, perseverance, excellence, and transformative leadership. The pause that followed felt like the moment before thunder, when the air becomes electric with anticipation and everyone holds their breath waiting for the sound that will change everything. Dr. Grace Miller, founder and CEO of Miller Strategic Consulting, published author, and as of this morning's announcement, the youngest dean in Northwestern's 170-year history. Dr. Miller will be leading our new School of Entrepreneurial Innovations starting this fall. The spotlights exploded across that ballroom like artillery fire, finding me in the crowd and bathing me in light so bright it felt like being struck by lightning made of pure vindication. The applause that followed wasn't the polite recognition of academic ceremony. It was the thunderous acknowledgement of someone who'd achieved the kind of success that rewrites assumptions about what's possible when potential meets persistence. Camera flashes strobed like a storm across the ballroom, each burst capturing the moment when 16 years of quiet revenge finally announced itself to the world. Professional photographers from the university's marketing department worked alongside society journalists who understood they were documenting something more significant than another alumni award ceremony. But it was the reactions in the crowd that really told the story of what was happening in that room. Tyler's champagne glass slipped from fingers that had lost their ability to maintain grip on anything, including the reality that the sister he'd dismissed as someone whose dreams didn't matter had just been announced as the youngest dean in the university's nearly 2-century history. The sound of crystal hitting marble echoed like a gunshot through conversations that had suddenly fallen silent. Champagne spread across the floor in a golden puddle that reflected the spotlights, creating a small lake of expensive alcohol that nobody moved to clean up because everyone was too busy processing the magnitude of what they'd just heard. My mother stood frozen near the university president's table, her face cycling through expressions that ranged from shock to disbelief to something that might have been pride if it hadn't been complicated by 16 years of complicity in decisions that had nearly derailed the daughter she was now watching command the attention of 500 successful people. "Grace," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the applause that seemed to grow stronger rather than fade, as if the crowd was processing the full implications of what they were witnessing and deciding that ordinary clapping wasn't adequate for this moment. Her lips parted in the kind of disbelief that comes when fundamental assumptions about reality get challenged by evidence that can't be argued with or explained away. The daughter who'd been told education wouldn't feed her had just been announced as someone who would now be feeding education to the next generation of students. Tyler buried his face in his hands like he was trying to disappear into the palms that had once been raised in triumphant toasts to success built on his sister's sacrifice. The confident smirk that had carried him through years of inherited privilege was gone, replaced by the hollow recognition that the college fund theft had produced exactly one successful graduate, and it wasn't him. Around the ballroom, conversations buzzed with the kind of energy that comes when people realize they're witnessing a story that will be told and retold for years. Alumni who'd known Tyler during his Northwestern years now looked between the brother who'd squandered advantages and the sister who'd built success from nothing, their faces reflecting calculations about fairness, merit, and the ways that family dynamics sometimes produce outcomes that feel more like justice than coincidence. But the person whose reaction mattered most was my father, who stood near the bar where Tyler had been lurking, his expression cycling through recognition, shame, and something that looked dangerously close to the realization that the most important investment decision of his life had been exactly backwards. He'd funded the son who'd failed and stolen from the daughter who'd succeeded beyond anything his limited imagination had considered possible when he'd made that dinner table announcement 16 years ago. As I walked toward the podium through applause that felt like absolution, I thought about that 17-year-old girl who'd cried herself to sleep the night they stole her college fund. She could never have imagined that theft would become the foundation for success so complete that it would eventually put her in charge of educating the next generation at the same university her brother had attended with her money. The microphone felt familiar in my hands, not because I'd spoken at events like this before, but because I'd spent 16 years learning to use my voice in rooms where it mattered, where decisions got made, where success was measured by results rather than inheritance. "Thank you for that generous introduction," I said, my voice carrying across the ballroom with the authority that comes from earning rather than inheriting the right to speak. "And thank you to Northwestern University for this incredible honor." But as I looked out at that crowd of successful alumni, my eyes found the section where my family stood in various stages of shock, recognition, and what I hoped might eventually become understanding. The girl whose dreams they'd laughed away had just been appointed to shape dreams for thousands of students who would never know that their dean had once been told education was wasted on daughters. In the same kind of room where my dream had been stolen 16 years ago, my name was now roaring back as a verdict that theft had only delayed justice, not prevented it. The woman they'd underestimated was about to tell a room full of successful people exactly what she'd learned about the difference between inheriting opportunity and earning it. And every word would be dedicated to the 17-year-old girl who'd refused to let other people's limitations become her ceiling. Standing at that podium with 500 pairs of eyes focused on me, I felt the weight of 16 years of preparation converging into a single moment where everything I'd learned about survival, persistence, and the difference between inheriting opportunity and earning it would be distilled into words that could reshape how people thought about potential. The microphone carried my voice across that ballroom with crystalline clarity, each word measured and deliberate like testimony in a trial, where the verdict had already been determined by evidence that couldn't be argued with. 16 years ago, I began, my voice steady as the foundation I'd built from nothing. I was 17 years old when my family gathered around our dinner table and made a decision that would change my life forever. They told me that my college fund, money I'd saved from working at McDonald's, birthday checks I'd deposited, dreams I'd documented in notebooks filled with scholarship applications, would be given to my brother instead. The silence that followed was profound, the kind that comes when a room full of successful people realizes they're about to hear a story that will challenge every assumption they've made about merit, privilege, and who deserves recognition for achievements that look inevitable in hindsight, but were anything but guaranteed when the work was happening in darkness. I was told that education wouldn't feed me, that a good husband would take better care of me than any degree ever could, that girls like me were investments with poor returns because we'd just get married and waste what our families had sacrificed to provide. A murmur rippled through the crowd, the kind of uncomfortable recognition that comes when people hear their own assumptions spoken aloud and realize how they sound when stripped of the polite language that usually disguises systematic discrimination. "Tonight," I continued, my voice building with the authority that comes from turning limitation into liberation, "I stand before you as the youngest dean in Northwestern University's 170-year history, proof that resilience feeds more than survival, it feeds legacy." The applause that erupted wasn't the polite recognition of academic ceremony. It was the thunderous acknowledgement of justice delayed but not denied, vindication earned through 16 years of refusing to accept other people's definitions of what daughters deserved or could achieve. But it was the faces in the crowd that really told the story of what was happening in that room. My mother sat at table 12 with tears streaming down cheeks that had once delivered limitations disguised as practical wisdom. The woman who'd whispered that education doesn't feed you was now watching her daughter prepare to feed education to thousands of students who would never know their dean had once been told her dreams didn't matter. My father stood near the back of the room with his hands clasped behind him like a defendant awaiting sentencing, his face cycling through recognition, shame, and what I hoped might eventually become understanding that the most important decision of his parenting career had been exactly backwards. But it was Tyler's reaction that completed the transformation that had begun 16 years earlier in our family's dining room. He'd shrunk into the shadows near the service entrance, his expensive but frayed suit making him look like someone who'd dressed for success but arrived at failure. The confident smirk that had carried him through years of inherited privilege was gone, replaced by the hollow recognition that stealing his sister's college fund had produced exactly one successful graduate, and it wasn't him. The brother who'd raised his wine glass in triumphant toast to success built on his sister's sacrifice now couldn't meet the eyes of the woman whose dreams he'd helped destroy, whose future he'd claimed for his own, whose potential he'd dismissed as less important than his inheritance. The degree they thought I didn't need became the foundation for everything I've built, I said, looking directly at the section where my family sat in various stages of recognition and regret. The education they believed was wasted on daughters became the weapon I used to rewrite not just my own story, but the stories of every student who will walk through the doors of our new school of entrepreneurial innovation. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone in that room. The girl whose college fund had been stolen to pay for her brother's education was now in charge of providing education to the next generation. The daughter who'd been told her dreams didn't matter was now responsible for nurturing dreams in thousands of students who would never know their dean had once scrubbed floors to pay for the knowledge she was now positioned to share. They stole my college fund, I said, my voice carrying across that ballroom, with the finality of a judge's gavel, but they could never steal my will. From betrayal, I built the very legacy they said I'd never touch. The standing ovation that followed felt like vindication made audible, justice transformed into sound that echoed off crystal chandeliers and marble floors. But more than recognition, it was validation that the girl who'd been told she was an investment with poor returns had just proven that some returns take longer to mature, but eventually pay dividends that compound far beyond what smaller minds could calculate. The spotlights framed me against the Northwestern University banner like a portrait of possibility realized, despite rather than because of family support. The same kind of room where my dreams had been dismissed 16 years ago was now witnessing those dreams announced as reality that would shape the futures of thousands of students. I hadn't just returned to claim recognition from the institution my brother had attended with my money. I had conquered the stage they'd once barred me from entering, transformed limitation into leadership, and proven that theft could become the foundation for success so complete that it redefined what justice looked like when patience was combined with persistence. The 17-year-old girl who'd cried herself to sleep the night they stole her college fund could never have imagined that betrayal would become the cornerstone for building something far more valuable than the education they'd thought she didn't deserve. She'd become the person who would provide that education to everyone who came after her. The woman they'd underestimated had just been appointed to make sure no other student would ever be told their dreams were investments with poor returns. And every degree she would award, every graduation she would preside over, every student whose potential she would nurture, would be a reminder that sometimes the most powerful revenge is building something so undeniable that theft becomes the catalyst for triumph rather than the cause of defeat. The stage they'd thought was too big for someone like me had just become exactly the right size for everything I'd always known I could become. If Grace's story reminded you that family betrayal can become the foundation for success they never imagined, hit that like button and let me know in the comments. Which moment in her journey hit you the hardest? Maybe you're the daughter whose education was considered less important than your brother's future. Maybe you've been told your dreams are impractical by people who never had to work for theirs. Maybe you know someone who needs to hear that being underestimated by family doesn't define your potential. Subscribe and turn on notifications because next week, we're diving into another story about quiet determination, creating explosive vindication. We're exploring the woman whose startup idea was stolen by her business partner, and how she built a competing company that destroyed his empire entirely. Share this video with someone who's been dismissed by their own family. Drop a comment telling me about a time your potential was underestimated or when you witnessed someone transform family cruelty into professional triumph. Your story might inspire our next video. Remember, they can steal your resources, redirect your funding, tell you that your gender makes your dreams worthless, but they can't steal your work ethic, your intelligence, or your refusal to accept their limitations as your ceiling. Sometimes the most powerful response to theft isn't demanding justice immediately. It's building something so undeniable that justice becomes inevitable. Until next time, keep working while they're underestimating you, because the best revenge is success that makes their betrayal look like the favor it actually was. The girl whose college fund they stole just became the dean who'll educate the next generation. Now it's your turn to transform their theft into your triumph.